So, next person, please. We're going to have someone speaking live now, and I'd like to welcome Dave Chapple, who is chair of the Bridgwater and District Civic Society and also secretary of Bridgwater Trades Union Council. Dave retired in 2016, having been a postman in Somerset for 38 years. And he's a lifelong trade unionist and a black music DJ. And I'll just add that he has already published one book about Bridgwater's history. That is the history of the 1926 general strike and Bridgwater's part in that. And in January, he's publishing another book about the history of Bridgwater from 1983 to 2004. When Bridgwater was still a working class left wing and rebel town. So we look forward to that. Dave, over to you, please, to talk about the women shirt workers of Taunton and Somerset when they struck in 1912. Thanks.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. On Wednesday, the 10th of July, 1912, 1,500 shirt and collar women in Bridgwater went out on strike and started a dispute, but more important than that, entered the pages of modern Bridgwater history. The women made shirts and collars at H.J. Van Trump's Bridgwater Tonevale Manufacturing Company, which became Van Hewson's in Bailey Street, and R.M. Moody's factory, two factories. The first that later became Gan Mills in New Road, and a larger factory in Dampier Street. About 1,500 workers. There were 300 workers at F.J. Wyatt's factory, which has only recently been demolished in Monmouth Street, and they didn't come out on strike. And the cause of the dispute, the strike, which lasted for 15 days, was the Liberal government's National Insurance Act, which compelled employers and workers to pay for the cost of unemployment insurance and sick absence insurance. And what happened in Van Trump's Tonevale manufacturing concern and R.M. Moody was that they asked the women to pay by charging them for the cotton that they used. The wages were 8 or 9 shillings a week, and a really good seamstress could get through 10,000 yards of cotton in a fortnight. And the average cut in wages the workers claimed was 9p. Earlier on in the year in Taunton, the Bridgwater workers had not supported them, and that caused problems later on. And the whole background to this dispute was before the First World War, there was large-scale rebellions going on, strikes going on, and perhaps England was closer to a real revolution than it had before or since. Suffragettes were seen in the town. The National Association of Women's Suffrage Movement, which was a middle-class body, met in the Oddfellows Hall. But more sensationally, the woman who claimed to have assaulted Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister, in Bristol, was seen walking the streets of Bridgwater, and for 2 days was followed closely around her lodgings in King Square by the police. There had been a national railway strike in 1911, a national miners' strike in 1912, gunboats in the River Mersey, and in 1913, a year after the strike, one of the most interesting passages of carnival history, where the local chief constable defied the Home Secretary and allowed the carnival bonfire and squibbing and the carnival to take place when the Home Secretary banned it. So it was a rebellious town, and certainly votes for women was in the air. And that's a fascinating connection with working class struggle. The highlights of the strike, which lasted for 15 days and certainly didn't achieve its aims, but was an achievement in itself, were many. There was a huge rally in Eastover Park where up to 3,000 women and their supporters met, and they were harangued by the Reverend H. Mould, the minister of the Mariners' Chapel in St. John Street, who urged them to go back to work, and they refused with cries of not until the cotton charges have been withdrawn. There was a rally in the Oddfellows Hall, which is still there in East Quay, where they heard report backs from the negotiations, and Van Trump threatened to shut the factory immediately. Then he threatened to shut his factory in Bailey Street in a week, and actually didn't shut it at all in the end. Hundreds of women canvassed for fundraising and knocked on door to door to raise funds for the strike. On the Monday after the first stoppage, when the stoppage was about 5 days old, the women decided to invade Taunton and to try and picket out the factories in Taunton, including one which is still there. It was Samuel White's factory in South Street, and I think that's just become a listed building and should be preserved. Unfortunately, the other factories, the Bridgwater factories, have been demolished. And I imagine a really good film director making a wonderful scene of this, because it's before the Broadway, it's outside the Queen's Hotel, and hundreds of striking shirt and collar women in charabancs. There was an advance guard of about 12 or 15 or 20 on bicycles, all with placards saying, "We won't go back, we won't pay for cotton." And the cyclists led the way, cycled down the A38 to Taunton, and they were accompanied by charabancs, 2 or 3 charabancs, and they were beginning to be unionized. And what's interesting is that the National Federation of Women Workers was the union. And the reason it was the National Federation of Women Workers was that the TUC at the time refused to allow any union that had women workers to join. The most remarkable scene, however, was on Thursday, the Thursday of the strike, and that involved mass picketing. So if you can imagine in 1911, with the docks railway taking place, and whether or not there was a man with a red flag taking trains to the docks across that junction, I'm not sure. But if you imagine that scene with the cross rifles and the occasional train going across for 3 or 4 hours, it was estimated by Inspector Story that 2,000 or 3,000, mostly women, were picketing. And the reason for that is some strike breakers had gone in to Van Trump's factory. And when those strike breakers came out, there was a melee. And I will quote from the Bridgwater Independent report. Between 7 and 8 p.m, a good deal of excitement prevailed in the neighbourhood of the Tonevale factory. A large crowd of the strikers waited in Rosebery Avenue for the arrival from the factory of those of the workers who had not come out. On the appearance of about 9 of the non-strikers, an ugly rush ensued, and several members of the police force went to the assistance of those who had been attacked. It is stated that several blows were struck in the skirmish, which ensued, but the police, who were also roughly handled, succeeded in getting the non-strikers away and escorted them to their houses. It is stated that the incident will have its sequel in police court proceedings. And it certainly did, because before the strike finished in Bridgwater Borough Police Court, a large crowd of strikers, said the Independent, were outside the court, but only a few were admitted. And in the dock were Mrs. Margaret Short of number 2 Court West Street, Mrs. Annie Davey of Quantock View Terrace in Bristol Road. Emmy Bailey, the third woman arrested for assault in the police and assault in non-strikers, had absconded to Cardiff, and an arrest warrant was put out for her. Mrs. Margaret Short and Mrs. Annie Davey were both married women of respectable appearance, and they were charged with assaulting Emma Squires of 80 Polden Street. There was no defence solicitor, and interestingly, the prosecutor was the town clerk, W.T. Baker. Inspector Story: 9 women left work, protected by myself and a number of constables. Mrs. Squires was molested and struck. Her hat was torn off and her hair pulled out. She got to Polden Street only under police protection. None of the 9 women went back to work during the dispute. Mrs. Emma Squires: when they got into Rosebery Avenue, there was an enormous crowd gathered, mostly women. Mrs. Davey came in on the left and tore off my hat. and the other woman, Mrs. Short, came and smacked me right in the face. Mrs. Short interjected, "It's a lie, I wasn't near you." Emma Squires, "I received many blows. The crowd was very hostile." Mrs. Short, "But there was a crowd of many thousands. How do you know it was me?" Inspector Story, "That's correct. I should think there was quite 2,000. Inspector Story went on, "The crowd was shouting, 'Tear her ... clothes off.'" Mrs. Annie Davy, "I only got hold of Emmy Squire's hair to save myself from going to the ground. If she had been a woman of principle, she would have stood by us for our rights." Inspector Story, "Mrs. Davy said she was not worse than the rest of the crowd, and that she would have given it more to Emma Squires if Inspector Story had not prevented her." The bench were not inclined to be severe in this case. Both defendants were fined 5 shillings with costs and the advocate's fee. On leaving the court, Short and Davy were met by the crowd, who loudly applauded them. I think it's remarkable in the context of gunboats in the Mersey and unrest up and down the country that 2 women who admitted assault in the police as well as assault in non-strikers were just fined 5 shillings. And I've got no doubt they didn't have to pay a penny if they had 2,000 or 3,000 supporters. The strike didn't succeed in its aims. Only a few of the factories in Taunton went out in solidarity. Wyatt's factory, interestingly, the Bridgwater Manufacturing Company in Monmouth Street, did not impose the charges. And some firms up and down the country, some textiles firms, just put it on their prices. However, Van Trump was obviously a viciously anti-union employer. He seemed to have dominated the R.M. Moody concern and led the whole thing, certainly in threatening to shut down his whole works, which he claimed he could dismantle within 24 hours. I think the leniency of the fines is remarkable. I think that the organization of the women was very impressive. You had mass picketing, and in the context of the time, I think the Bridgwater working class women who made shirts and collars and were to carry on as unionized women making shirts and collars right up until you had Leffman's, didn't you, which was underwear, and Gan Mills, which was one of the Moody's factories, only shut down comparatively recently, were a large part of the unionized workforce of Bridgwater over many years. And in terms of the unrest of that time, Keir Hardie, the leader of the Labour Party, said this at St Andrew's Hall in February 1912, just before the strike. He was received with prolonged cheering and said he believed that the present year would see the enfranchisement of women. Vast cheering again. There was only one thing that stood between them and the control of the country by the working classes, and that was the lack of unity in the ranks of the working class. Until they had a House of Commons dominated by a clear majority of Labour members who were themselves socialists, the socialist ideal would not be fully realised. Socialism stood for international peace and for eternal relationship amongst all the races of the earth. Socialism stood for freedom. They would fight their fight through to a clean finish, and they would do it all the better if there were no soldiers there to irritate them and annoy them by their presence. If there is to be war, said Keir Hardie, it is to be a revolutionary war to the finish. And the Bridgwater Independent, in brackets, put standing ovation, hip hip hurrah, and loud cheers. And of course the tragedy was not soldiers being employed to stop a revolution in Britain, but millions of British and other soldiers being killed in the war that ensued. The question I have to ask everybody really is why the remarkable first appearance of women en masse, of working class women in Bridgwater, has up to now been almost totally ignored and forgotten by everybody who cares about Bridgwater history. I think that's a shame, and I think that deserves to be recognised. And I'd like to pay tribute to Emmy Bailey, Mrs. Annie Davy, and Mrs. Margaret for being pioneers. And I'd like to see a plaque put up for them on the side of Rosebery Avenue, where 2,000 or 3,000 angry women were defending their rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for reminding us of the important role of women in the struggle for justice, for equality, and also, of course, the amazing role that Bridgwater has played in having workers in this town prepared to fight for better standards, for better conditions. In fact, only last week, postal workers in Bridgwater walked out unofficially in defence of one of their comrades who has been unfairly dismissed. So the fight goes on, and it's great to know that we are linked historically still as a town that is prepared to fight and to struggle. Thank you, Dave. Now I'm going to move on to